They didn't just have wealth, they displayed it. Every surface of that house was designed to remind you of it. Glass walls that caught the daylight, perfectly polished stone floors that reflected expensive furniture, art chosen more for price than meaning. At 75, I had lived through enough phases of life to know that real security is quiet. But the people I lived with believed wealth needed an audience. I sat at the long dining table that afternoon, sunlight pouring in from every direction, warming the room and exposing every detail. My posture was straight, my movement slow and deliberate, not from weakness but from habit. Across from me, my son-in-law leaned back comfortably, one arm draped over the chair, speaking loudly about markets, returns, and people who worked for him. He liked to narrate success. It made him feel larger than the room. My daughter moved between the kitchen and the table, careful, controlled, making sure everything looked perfect. She avoided my eyes more than once. I always noticed. Silence has a way of sharpening observation. The conversation drifted toward property values, long-term appreciation, decisions that separated smart money from people who didn't understand how things worked anymore. I listened quietly until I offered a simple comment, something drawn from experience rather than theory. I didn't challenge him, I didn't correct him, I just spoke. He smiled before he laughed. It was the kind of laugh meant to educate, meant to signal superiority without appearing aggressive. "That's an old perspective," he said, still smiling. "Things change when you actually have capital." The room stilled. I felt my daughter tense beside him. She looked down at the table, tracing an invisible line with her finger. She said nothing. That silence carried more weight than his words ever could. I met his gaze calmly. "Capital doesn't replace judgment," I said. "It just gives it more room to fail." He chuckled again, shaking his head. "Sure," he replied, indulgent. That might have mattered back then. Back then, the phrase landed exactly where he intended it to, on age, on relevance, on worth. Conversation moved on without me. He continued speaking, confident, animated, surrounded by luxury that supported every assumption he made about himself. I stayed quiet, not because I had been defeated, but because I understood something important. Men who flaunt wealth mistake reaction for power. Silence unsettles them far more than argument ever could. When the meal ended, I stood and excused myself without ceremony. No one followed. No one asked if I was all right. I walked down the wide hallway lined with expensive art he liked to show guests and closed the door to my room. The space was immaculate, designed, impersonal. Luxury without history feels like that. Inside a locked drawer was a slim leather folder I hadn't opened in years. I took it out slowly and placed it on the desk. My hands were steady. Inside were documents that didn't care about money being flaunted or confidence being displayed. Deeds, records, legal confirmations, proof that ownership doesn't always announce itself. They flaunted their wealth because they believed it made them untouchable. They believed luxury meant authority. They believed my quiet presence meant insignificance. What they didn't know was that every assumption they stood on existed only because I had allowed it. And the documents they had never seen were already organized, reviewed, and waiting for the moment when wealth would stop speaking for them. That afternoon, as daylight filled the glass walls of the house, I realized something with absolute clarity. Power doesn't need to perform, it only needs proof, and soon the documents would take everything back. After that afternoon, the way they flaunted wealth became more deliberate. It wasn't just about what they owned anymore, it was about reminding me who they believed controlled it. Sunlight still poured through the glass walls each morning, illuminating marble floors and designer furniture, but the atmosphere felt colder. Wealth had shifted from decoration to weapon, subtle but constant. My son-in-law grew more confident by the day. He spoke less to me and more around me, discussing plans as if my presence were incidental. Conversations about travel, investments, and future renovations unfolded openly in front of me, never once pausing for my input. When I did speak, he responded politely, briefly, then redirected the discussion back to where he wanted it. Dismissal when dressed in luxury looks almost courteous. He began to reframe my existence as inefficiency. Comments slipped into conversation about how large homes require energy, how resources should be optimized, how life works best when everyone pulls their weight. He never accused me directly. He didn't have to. The implication sat comfortably between us, supported by glass, stone, and expensive silence. My daughter noticed the shift, even if she didn't confront it. I saw it in the way her shoulders tightened when he spoke about responsibility, in the way she avoided my eyes when discussions turned toward the future. She was tired, caught between comfort and conscience. Silence had become her compromise, and I paid the price for it. One morning, he stood in the open living room, speaking loudly on the phone, sunlight catching the metal of his watch as he gestured. He talked about leverage, about managing people who didn't know when to step aside, about how wealth creates clarity when emotions get in the way. He didn't lower his voice when he noticed me nearby. He glanced at me briefly, then continued as if I were part of the architecture. When the call ended, he looked satisfied, as though the world had once again confirmed his position. At dinner that evening, he dominated the table. He spoke about expanding the property, about making the house reflect where things were going. He referred to it as his place casually, repeatedly. Each time my daughter shifted slightly, but she never corrected him. Neither did I. Silence once again worked in my favor. At one point, he looked directly at me and said, "Wealth changes perspective, that people either adapt or fall behind." His tone was almost generous, as if offering advice. I replied calmly that wealth doesn't eliminate consequences, it only delays them. He smiled, indulgent, clearly amused by what he saw as an outdated warning. That was when I understood fully. In his mind, I was already a temporary problem. a figure from the past to be managed gently once timing allowed, and because he believed that, he stopped hiding his intentions. Articles about downsizing appeared on the counters. Conversations about long-term arrangements surfaced under the guise of concern. Everything was polite, everything was calculated. Late that day, my daughter spoke to me quietly. She said he was thinking ahead, that he worried about efficiency and sustainability, that the house required a certain kind of lifestyle. She said she hoped I understood. I told her I did. It was easier than explaining the truth, that understanding didn't mean agreement and silence didn't mean surrender. That night, alone in my room as daylight faded behind the glass walls, I opened the leather folder again. I reviewed every document carefully. Ownership, conditions, authority, everything was clear, everything was intact. The wealth they flaunted existed because I had put it there. His confidence rested entirely on assumptions he had never verified. The next morning, I made a few quiet calls, professional, precise, conversations with people who recognized my voice immediately and spoke to me with respect that had nothing to do with luxury. When I hung up, I felt grounded. Wealth does not create power, it only borrows it. They believed flaunting money made them superior. They believed comfort had settled every question. They believed my silence meant surrender. What they didn't know was that the documents they had never asked about were already moving closer to the moment when wealth would stop speaking for them and the truth would take everything back. By the third week, the way they flaunted wealth no longer felt performative. It had become structural. It shaped how rooms were used, how conversations flowed, how decisions were made. My son-in-law moved through the luxury house with the ease of someone who believed ownership had already been settled, not legally, emotionally. And emotional certainty, I learned, can be far more dangerous than paperwork when it goes unchallenged. I noticed the change in small, deliberate ways. Furniture was rearranged without discussion. Cabinets were reorganized. Items that had been in the same place for years were quietly moved, boxed, or relocated as if they were already unnecessary. He spoke openly about redesigning spaces, about aligning the house with the future, about removing things that no longer served a purpose. Each time he said it, I understood exactly what he meant. The future he imagined did not include me. When I entered a room, conversations no longer paused. They simply adjusted to exclude me. When I spoke, responses came late, brief, or not at all. It wasn't hostility, it was efficiency. He had decided I was no longer relevant, and relevance in his world was determined by money and momentum. Everything else was background noise. One afternoon, he spread documents across a sleek glass table in the living room and waved me over casually. Bills, expense summaries, projections. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating numbers he believed would intimidate me. He explained them slowly, carefully, as though I had never planned beyond a paycheck. He pointed to costs and then said, with practiced concern, that it wasn't realistic for one person to remain dependent forever. The implication was clear. This wasn't about finances. It was about positioning me as a liability. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he waited, expecting discomfort or defense. Instead, I thanked him for explaining and told him I appreciated transparency. The calm response unsettled him. For a brief moment, his confidence wavered. Then it returned stronger because he mistook restraint for agreement. People like him always do. My daughter stood nearby, watching quietly. I saw the conflict in her eyes, the exhaustion of carrying two truths at once. Later that evening, she spoke to me in private. Her voice was soft, apologetic, careful. She said he was under pressure, that he worried about sustainability, that he just wanted clarity for the future. She didn't say where I fit into that clarity. She didn't have to. I told her I understood. Silence had become our shared language, even though it cost us differently. That night, alone in my room as daylight faded behind the glass walls, I opened the leather folder again. I didn't skim, I didn't rush. I read every page slowly. Deeds, trust structures, legal protections. The will, everything was deliberate, everything was secure. The authority he believed wealth had given him was never his to take. He had mistaken proximity for control and luxury for ownership. The next morning, I made several calls, quiet ones, efficient ones, conversations with people who knew exactly who I was and exactly what I controlled. No one spoke over me, no one explained things slowly, no one laughed. When the calls ended, I felt steady, reminded of something wealth often hides. Money doesn't create power. It only reveals who already has it. A few days later, he mentioned casually that a lawyer would be coming by to review some documents. He said it with confidence, almost smug, as if the meeting existed to formalize his position. My daughter looked uneasy but said nothing. I said nothing either. Silence once again worked in my favor. That night, lying awake in a house filled with glass, light, and assumption, I understood the truth clearly. They believed flaunting wealth had settled the hierarchy. They believed luxury had rewritten history. They believed I had already been reduced to a formality. What they didn't realize was that authority doesn't come from display. It comes from documentation, and the documents they had never asked about were already positioned to take everything back. The day the lawyer arrived looked no different from any other. Daylight poured through the glass walls, reflecting off marble floors and expensive surfaces that had become symbols of assumed power. That normalcy was what made the moment irreversible. My son-in-law greeted the lawyer with confidence, shaking his hand firmly, smiling as though this meeting existed to confirm what he already believed. He gestured toward the living room like a host welcoming validation, not realizing he was ushering in the end of every assumption he had built. We sat where wealth was meant to impress. He leaned back comfortably, arms crossed, posture relaxed. My daughter sat beside him tense, her discomfort no longer hidden by luxury. I sat across from them, calm, composed, my silence no longer protective but purposeful. The lawyer placed his briefcase on the glass table and opened it slowly. The sound of clasps releasing cut through the room with more force than any raised voice ever could. The lawyer began reading in a measured, neutral tone, dates, transactions, property records. At first, my son-in-law barely listened. His gaze drifted to the windows, to the house itself, as if the walls would speak for him. But as the reading continued, his posture changed. He leaned forward. When the lawyer stated clearly that the property had been purchased outright decades earlier, my son-in-law laughed once, reflexively, the same laugh he had used when he believed himself superior. This time it sounded thin. There must be some confusion, he said lightly. The lawyer did not respond. He continued reading, transfer limitations. Legal protections, structures established long before wealth became something to flaunt. Each sentence dismantled another layer of confidence my son-in-law relied on. The room grew quiet. My daughter's breathing changed. She turned toward me slowly, disbelief giving way to understanding. She looked at the documents, then at me. I met her eyes and nodded once. No defense, no explanation, just truth. My son-in-law interrupted, his voice sharper now, frustration breaking through polish. He said this couldn't be right. He said he would have known. The lawyer looked up briefly and explained calmly that assumptions do not alter legal reality. He resumed reading without hesitation. Then the will was introduced. The lawyer's tone did not change as he outlined its terms, assets, conditions, intent, the house, the absence of a name that expected to be included. The color drained from my son-in-law's face. His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since I had known him, he had nothing prepared. No leverage, no dismissal, no laughter. My daughter stood abruptly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. She asked why I had never told her. I told her quietly that I wanted her life built on respect, not dependence, and that I never believed silence would be mistaken for weakness. Her expression shifted not to anger but to recognition. She finally understood what wealth had been masking. I stood then not to dominate the room but to reclaim it. I told him calmly that he had mistaken money for power and display for ownership. I told him authority does not come from confidence or luxury, it comes from control, documented and undeniable. I did not raise my voice, I did not need to. The lawyer closed the file. The sound echoed, final and absolute. In that moment, wealth stopped speaking for them, and the assumptions they flaunted had nothing left to stand on. After the lawyer left, the luxury house felt different. Nothing had physically changed. The glass walls still reflected daylight, the marble floors still gleamed, the furniture still sat exactly where it always had, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Wealth no longer filled the space with confidence. Instead, truth settled in, heavy and undeniable, occupying every corner where assumption once lived. My son-in-law stayed seated for a long time, staring at nothing. The man who once flaunted wealth like armor now looked small within it. His shoulders were slumped, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees as if he no longer knew where to place them. He did not look at me, he couldn't. The authority he believed money had given him had evaporated, and without it he was exposed. Wealth hadn't failed him, it had simply stopped protecting him. My daughter stood near the glass wall overlooking the property, arms wrapped around herself. When she finally turned toward me, her face carried something deeper than shock. It was recognition. She apologized quietly, not with excuses or justifications, but with honesty, for staying silent, for choosing comfort over courage, for letting wealth and appearance dictate what she thought was stability. I told her forgiveness didn't need an explanation. Understanding had finally arrived, and that mattered more than anything else. Later, when the house was quieter, my son-in-law spoke to me alone. His voice was careful now, stripped of arrogance, measured in a way it had never been before. He talked about pressure, about responsibility, about believing wealth made him superior because that's what everyone around him rewarded. I listened without interrupting, not because his explanation mattered, but because listening no longer cost me anything. When he finished, I told him calmly that respect doesn't begin after consequences. It begins long before entitlement feels safe. Life inside the house changed after that day, not dramatically but permanently. Conversations slowed, declarations disappeared. He no longer spoke as if the future belonged solely to him. He asked questions, he waited. The man who once treated me like background noise now measured every word in my presence, not out of fear but out of awareness. The hierarchy he assumed had collapsed, replaced by reality. In the weeks that followed, decisions were made quietly. No ultimatums, no forced endings. My daughter needed time to understand her life without wealth defining authority. I needed peace. Both were possible now. I moved freely through the house without shrinking myself. Silence, when it came, belonged to me by choice, not necessity. I still wake early. I still sit in the daylight as it fills the glass walls and brings the house to life. People greet me the same way they always have, with respect that was never tied to money or display. The only thing that truly changed was inside me. I no longer questioned my worth. I no longer allowed wealth to speak louder than truth. The documents were never about revenge. They were about clarity, about boundaries, about reminding everyone, including myself, that authority is not bought, performed, or flaunted. It is established quietly, patiently, long before it is ever tested, and when the documents were finally opened, everything they flaunted was taken back, not by force, not by anger, but by truth standing exactly where it always had.